At 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands in August of 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong watched helplessly as his wingman's P-38 Lightning spiraled down into the Pacific below. 3 Japanese Zeros had ambushed them from a higher altitude, and now Bong found himself alone with the lead Zero closing rapidly on his tail. He initiated the standard defensive maneuver, banking hard to the right and pushing the throttle to full power, hoping to climb away from the threat. Yet the Zero could turn far tighter. The Japanese pilot was already sliding into firing position, leaving Bong with perhaps only 4 seconds before 20mm cannon rounds would tear through his plane. What followed next was something no training syllabus had ever prepared him for. Bong flipped his Lightning completely upside down and shoved the control stick forward. Instead of climbing away from his attacker, the aircraft plunged toward the ocean. But because he was inverted, the maneuver pulled him in a direction the Zero pilot had never expected. Blood flooded into Bong's head, and the edges of his vision turned crimson. For 2 crucial seconds, his sight blurred so badly he could barely read the instruments in front of him. When he leveled the aircraft again at 12,000 feet, the Zero had overshot him, streaking past, and now completely out of position. Bong had survived, and in doing so had unintentionally uncovered a maneuver that would soon transform aerial combat across the Pacific theater. It was a technique that broke nearly every rule ever taught in flight school. Instructors back at the training fields in California and Arizona had specifically warned against negative G flight, citing risks of engine failure, airframe stress, and pilot blackout. The official doctrine was unambiguous, but in the chaos of real combat, when a Zero was already lining up its guns, those cautions meant far less than the instinct to survive. The pilots who endured their first encounters with the Zero learned an unforgiving truth. Traditional aerial combat doctrine was getting American flyers killed. Japanese aviators had refined their methods through years of continuous warfare over China and knew precisely how to exploit every advantage of their Mitsubishi A6M fighters. American pilots were dying because they fought according to peacetime training rules against an enemy who had long since abandoned them. The emergence of inverted flight tactics marked something more profound than a footnote in military history. Between 1942 and 1944, a relatively small fraternity of fighter pilots discovered that the human body could tolerate stresses aviation medicine once considered fatal. They learned their aircraft could withstand maneuvers that engineers had insisted would rip wings from fuselages. Most importantly, they proved that sometimes survival demanded flying straight toward the danger rather than fleeing from it. This was not the polished version of air combat described in official reports. It was improvisation born from desperation, brutal ingenuity forged in moments where a single decision determined who returned home and who became another name on a casualty list. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero had first entered combat over China in 1940, and by the time America joined the war in December 1941, Japanese pilots had already logged thousands of hours mastering their craft. The Zero's flight performance presented a lethal challenge for Allied airmen. At speeds below 300 miles per hour, it could outturn nearly every Allied fighter. Its combat turning radius was roughly 400 feet tighter than that of a P-38 Lightning and nearly 500 feet smaller than an F-4F Wildcat. In a conventional turning dogfight, the kind emphasized in American flight schools, the Zero pilot could simply carve a smaller circle, slip inside his opponent's turn, and line up a shot within seconds. Early battle reports from the Philippines and Java painted a bleak picture. American pilots attempted boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude, firing, and climbing back to safety. But if that first strike didn't destroy the target, the Zero would instantly bank into a sharp horizontal turn. When the American pilot tried to follow, he found himself losing energy, trapped on the outer edge of the circle, and suddenly transformed from hunter into prey. By mid-1942, kill ratios in several regions favored the Japanese 3-1. Squadron commanders began submitting reports admitting the obvious. They could not win turning fights against the Zero. The Navy's F-4F Wildcat, flown by both Navy and Marine pilots, could dive faster and withstand more battle damage, yet its roll rate was painfully slow. The P-40 Warhawk excelled in vertical maneuvers, but performed poorly at high altitudes, where most encounters occurred. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning carried formidable firepower, but its wide turning radius made it vulnerable in horizontal engagements. Each American fighter offered certain advantages: firepower, armor, diving speed, but none could rival the Zero's unmatched agility in traditional maneuvering combat. Pilots were instructed to rely on their aircraft's strengths, to avoid turning engagements, and to preserve energy advantage. It was sound guidance in theory, yet real combat seldom unfolded according to the plan. What made this tactical predicament even worse was the extraordinary skill of Japan's naval aviators during 1942 and early 1943. Many of those Japanese pilots had been flying combat missions since the late 1930s. They had mastered energy management, deflection shooting, and formation tactics to an exceptional degree. They knew precisely how to maneuver American pilots into situations where the Zero's superior turning ability became the deciding factor. One of their most common tactics involved a single Zero acting as bait, flying straight and level to appear exposed and vulnerable. When an American pilot took the bait and dove into attack, two more Zeros would suddenly drop from above or swing in from the sides. In moments, the American found himself on the defensive, forced into a turning fight where the Zero's agility became impossible to counter. The geometry of turning combat is brutally simple and unforgiving. A plane's turning radius depends entirely on speed and G-force. The Zero's lightweight frame, achieved in part by omitting armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, gave it a distinct advantage in turn performance. American fighters, on the other hand, were built with armor plating behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing tanks, and heavier weapons. These safety features helped aviators survive hits, but also added hundreds of pounds, increasing wing loading and widening the turn radius. In effect, American pilots were expected to defeat an opponent with the greatest advantage in turning combat, while flying aircraft designed more for survivability than pure maneuverability. The maneuver that would ultimately save countless American lives did not originate in any flight manual or tactical lecture. It came from raw desperation and accidental discovery. The split S, as it became known, required rolling the aircraft inverted and pulling through into a steep diving turn. Under normal flight conditions, pilots experience positive G-forces, which push blood toward their legs and cause vision to narrow. Around 5 or 6 Gs, many pilots begin to experience grayout or total blackout. But when a pilot rolls upside down and pushes the control stick forward, the forces reverse, producing negative Gs. Blood surges toward the head, and the resulting effect, known as redout, occurs because the visual field literally turns red as the blood vessels in the eyes swell. Aviation medicine in 1942 maintained that humans could barely tolerate negative G-forces at all. Studies at the time indicated that even -2 Gs caused severe pain, dizziness, and sometimes retinal damage. The official recommendation was to avoid negative G flight completely. Yet these experiments had been conducted under calm laboratory conditions with test pilots who were not fighting for their lives. In actual combat, 2 seconds of redout vision followed by escape was infinitely preferable to remaining a stationary target in a Zero's gun sight. A pilot who maintained textbook positive G flight but stayed within a Zero's aim would die. The choice was never between comfort and discomfort. It was between temporary blindness and permanent death. The physics explaining why the inverted dive worked came down to energy control and breaking the enemy's prediction model. When a Zero pilot gained a position on an enemy's tail, he assumed the target would either attempt to outturn him, which was hopeless, or climb away, which drained speed and made the aircraft easier to hit. The inverted dive did neither. It traded altitude for speed along a flight path the Zero pilot hadn't anticipated. Even more critically, if the Japanese pilot tried to follow, he encountered severe structural challenges. The Zero was rated for positive G loads up to about 7 Gs, but its light airframe made it extremely vulnerable to negative G stress. Pulling negative Gs could result in engine trouble or even airframe failure because the aircraft's systems weren't designed for sustained inverted flight. The P-38 Lightning's twin Allison engines gave it a unique advantage in such situations. Unlike single-engine fighters equipped with carbureted engines that often suffered fuel starvation during inverted flight, the P-38's fuel systems operated more reliably under negative G conditions. This was not an intentional design feature. Lockheed's engineers had never envisioned inverted combat tactics, yet this mechanical quirk became tactically significant. A P-38 pilot could maintain full engine power during an inverted dive, while a pursuing Zero might briefly lose thrust, widening the gap and allowing escape. The human body's tolerance for negative G-forces also proved greater than medical experts had claimed, provided the exposure was short. Pilots later reported that the red-out effect lasted only a few seconds during a well-executed split S, and vision returned quickly once positive G-forces resumed during the pullout. The pain was real: headaches, burst capillaries, and bloodshot eyes, but it was survivable. Several flyers mentioned in their debriefings that they would rather return to base with a throbbing headache than be buried at sea. Their logic was brutally simple. Negative G flight hurt, but Japanese cannon shells hurt far worse. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38 Lightnings from Port Moresby in New Guinea, became the first recorded pilot to use the inverted dive intentionally rather than out of instinct. On April 11, 1943, while leading a 4-plane patrol over the Huon Gulf, his formation encountered 8 Zeros at 20,000 feet. When the lead Zero dove on him, Lynch immediately rolled inverted instead of entering a conventional horizontal fight. He pulled his P-38 through into a sharp dive, accelerating past 400 miles per hour before leveling off at 8,000 feet. The Zero pilot chasing him pulled out much higher, around 12,000 feet, either unwilling or unable to match Lynch's steep dive angle and rapid descent. Lynch not only survived the attack but completely reversed the situation. Once level, he possessed both altitude separation and superior speed. Using that energy advantage, he climbed again, this time approaching the now disorganized Japanese formation from below. The Zeros had lost their coordination, chasing after what they assumed were retreating American fighters. In the engagement that followed, Lynch shot down 2 Zeros. His wingmen, copying his inverted dive, also escaped without a single loss. The after-action report mentioned the maneuver but gave it little emphasis. Official doctrine continued to discourage any negative G flight. What made Lynch's actions remarkable was his deliberate intent. Other pilots had rolled inverted in panic, survived, and later dismissed the outcome as sheer luck. Lynch, however, understood that it could be repeated. Within a week, he was personally demonstrating the move to fellow squadron pilots in informal briefings. His guidance was straightforward. If a Zero locked onto your tail and you couldn't shake him with standard maneuvers, roll inverted, pull through, dive hard, and use the gained speed to break contact. Don't attempt to outturn him in the horizontal plane, use the vertical instead. The Zero ruled the horizontal turn, but American fighters dominated in the vertical dive. By June of 1943, this approach had spread across other P-38 squadrons based at Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots exchanged details about it during ready room talks and informal debriefings. The tactic remained mostly unofficial, not exactly forbidden, but never written into official manuals either. Squadron commanders acknowledged its effectiveness, yet hesitated to include it in formal doctrine. Liability was one concern. If a pilot died attempting it, questions would quickly arise about who had authorized a maneuver contradicting established training procedures. So it spread by word of mouth, experienced veterans demonstrating it quietly to new arrivals without ever putting it on paper. When the 475th Fighter Group arrived in the Southwest Pacific in August 1943, they received informal instruction on the inverted dive from combat-seasoned pilots of the 49th Fighter Group. Major Charles McDonald, who later became one of the Pacific Theater's top aces with 27 confirmed kills, credited the split S maneuver with saving his life on multiple occasions. His combat reports from late 1943 reveal a clear pattern: engage Zeros from altitude, make a high-speed attack, and if countered during the climb back up, roll inverted and dive away, then re-enter the fight on better terms. It wasn't graceful aerial dueling. It was practical, survival-driven tactics that happened to win battles. The physical toll of negative G flight was something few training manuals ever addressed adequately. During a typical split S pulling -2 to -3 Gs, blood pressure in the head rose sharply. Pilots reported an immediate surge of pressure behind their eyes, followed by the readout effect where their vision flooded crimson. This was caused by the blood vessels in the eyes and face swelling under the negative acceleration. For those 2 or 3 seconds, pilots were effectively blind, relying solely on muscle memory and instrument familiarity to stay in control. Flight surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in late 1943, studied the after-effects on dozens of pilots who frequently used the inverted dive. Nearly all showed signs of petechial hemorrhaging, tiny ruptured blood vessels leaving red spots on their faces, especially around the eyes and forehead. Some even suffered subconjunctival hemorrhages that turned their eyes blood red for days. Headaches were nearly universal. A few reported temporary vision issues such as blurred sight or trouble focusing that lasted several hours after landing. Moorhead's informal conclusion, never published officially, was that while these maneuvers caused short-term physical strain, they resulted in no permanent damage. The true danger lay in the brief moment of blindness itself. During those seconds of readout, a pilot couldn't see his altimeter, airspeed gauge, or attitude indicators. He certainly couldn't see the enemy or the ocean rising fast below. The move demanded absolute faith in one's instincts and training. A pilot had to commit fully, set the dive angle, hold the negative Gs, and maintain that input until vision returned, trusting that his altitude estimate was correct before rolling upright. Several fatal crashes during training happened when pilots began the maneuver too low or stayed inverted too long. There was zero margin for error below 5,000 feet. At 15,000, however, a pilot had time to recover. Survival became a calculation. Never attempt inversion below 8,000 feet unless death was otherwise certain. Veteran pilots eventually developed small tricks to reduce the readout's intensity. Some learned to tense their neck and facial muscles to slow blood flow toward the head. Others found that by pulling the stick a little less aggressively, sacrificing some maneuver efficiency for clearer vision, they could maintain partial sight through most of the dive. It became a matter of judgment. Applying maximum negative G input created the fastest possible separation from a pursuing zero, but resulted in total visual blackout. Using moderate negative G input allowed a pilot to retain partial vision, though it weakened the overall escape maneuver. In reality, most pilots chose full separation. Better to be blind for 3 seconds and alive than partially aware and dead. The psychological challenge, however, was immense. Human instinct strongly resists actions that cause pain or sensory loss. Forcing oneself into temporary blindness while an enemy tries to kill you runs contrary to every survival reflex. Yet pilots learn to suppress that fear. The first time was terrifying. The second time still filled them with dread. By the 5th or 6th attempt, it became just another unpleasant necessity of aerial combat. Like flak, like rationing fuel, like watching a friend not return from a mission. The body adapted, and so did the mind. What seemed unimaginable in training soon became routine when the alternative was taking a 20-millimeter shell through the canopy. The inverted dive tactic spread across the Pacific like a secret message, passed from one squadron to another without ever appearing in official tactical manuals. By September 1943, P-38 units throughout New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were teaching the maneuver to replacement pilots within their first week in the theater. Training remained informal, veteran flyers pulling new arrivals aside after evening meals, quietly explaining what worked and what got people killed. Commanders knew it was happening. Some openly supported it, while others looked the other way, maintaining plausible deniability should 5th Air Force Headquarters begin asking questions about unauthorized instruction. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group and flying P-47 Thunderbolts from Port Moresby, formally incorporated the split S into his squadron's tactics by October 1943. The P-47 was heavier than the P-38 and hopelessly inferior to the Zero in turning duels. But the Thunderbolt could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and its radial engine managed negative G flight surprisingly well. Kirby's philosophy was practical. He told his pilots bluntly that trying to turn with a zero meant death, but using the P-47's mass and horsepower to dominate vertical combat, striking from above and diving away inverted when necessary, meant survival and victory. Kirby personally shot down 6 Japanese planes on October 11, 1943, employing those exact tactics, earning the Medal of Honor for that mission. In early 1944, Marine Corps F-4U Corsair squadrons began adopting similar methods. The Corsair outperformed the Zero in nearly every category except turning radius. Marine aviators flying from island bases like Munda and Vella La Vella found the inverted dive even more effective in the Corsair than in twin-engine fighters. Its powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine maintained thrust under negative G loads, and the Corsair's sturdy frame allowed pilots to pull out of steep dives at high speed without fear of structural failure. Major Robert Gaylor, who instructed tactics for VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, demonstrated the maneuver repeatedly, stressing that it was a defensive survival tactic rather than an offensive move. By mid-1944, the technique had reached Navy carrier groups across the Central Pacific. Fighter squadrons aboard carriers such as USS Essex and USS Lexington were now receiving briefings that included inverted maneuvers as standard defensive options. Terminology varied. Some pilots called it the split S, others the negative G break. A few simply described it as rolling out downward. The wording didn't matter. The execution stayed the same. When standard defensive moves failed, the rule was simple: invert and dive. The safety floor remained around 8,000 feet. Below that altitude, pilots were expected to find alternative escape tactics or accept that they were in a fight to the finish. Not every aircraft could safely perform the maneuver. Navy F-6F Hellcat pilots reported that their carbureted engines sometimes sputtered or cut out during prolonged inverted flight, though power usually returned quickly. Army Air Force P-40 pilots confirmed their planes were structurally capable of the maneuver, but lacked the dive speed to create enough distance from pursuing Zeros. These differences made tactics heavily aircraft dependent. A P-38 pilot could rely on the inverted dive as his main defensive escape, while a P-40 pilot needed other options. Still, the core idea became universal across the Pacific. Vertical tactics, including inverted maneuvers when required, consistently outperformed horizontal turning fights. Eventually, Japanese pilots recognized the American inverted dive strategy and began working on countermeasures of their own. By the end of 1943, combat reports from surviving Zero pilots began mentioning American fighters rolling inverted and diving away at extreme speed. Early Japanese evaluations interpreted this behavior as purely defensive, a sign that American pilots feared close-range combat and were fleeing rather than fighting. This assumption was strategically dangerous for Japanese aviators because it reinforced their old tactical mindset while ignoring the true purpose of the maneuver. The inverted dive was not a retreat. It was a reset that allowed American pilots to dictate when and how they re-entered combat on their own terms. Some Japanese pilots attempted to pursue American fighters through these inverted dives. The outcome was frequently deadly. The Zero's light structure, which granted it superior agility in turns, became a severe disadvantage during high-speed vertical dives. The aircraft's frame was designed for positive G stress limits, but had little tolerance for the demands of negative G flight. Several Zero pilots who tried to chase P-38s through steep inverted dives encountered control surface flutter or even structural failure. Others discovered that their Nakajima Sake engine suffered fuel delivery issues during inverted flight, leading to sudden power loss at the worst possible time, mid-dive, while attempting to track their opponents. A recorded engagement from December 1944 over Leyte Gulf demonstrated just how lethal the tactic could be when Japanese pilots tried to counter it. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, flying a P-38, found himself engaged by 4 Zeros at 18,000 feet. When the lead Zero gained a firing position, McGuire rolled his Lightning inverted and dove. The Japanese pilot followed, keeping McGuire centered in his gun sight. Then 2 critical things occurred simultaneously. Maguire's P-38 accelerated past 450 miles per hour while maintaining full control, and the pursuing Zero began to shake violently at roughly 380 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot was forced to break off the dive early or risk catastrophic structural failure. Maguire leveled out at 6,000 feet, regained altitude with his speed advantage, and re-engaged, shooting down 2 of the 4 Zeros. The remaining 2 disengaged. The deeper issue for Japanese aviators was that their most successful aircraft, the Zero, had by late 1944 become optimized for a form of combat that no longer existed. Early in the war, when battles took place at moderate altitudes and involved sustained turning duels, the Zero's characteristics had been nearly perfect. But as American tactics evolved toward faster vertical slashing attacks, the Zero's former strengths became obsolete. Its weaknesses, lack of armor, fragile airframe, and limited dive speed, turned into fatal flaws. Japanese engineers understood this problem. Later Zero variants and newer interceptors like the J-2M Raiden featured stronger structures and improved dive capability, but they entered service in small numbers and far too late to shift the tactical balance. Japan's training system couldn't adapt quickly enough either. By 1944, experienced combat pilots were being lost faster than replacements could be produced. New trainees received shortened instruction focused on basic flying and traditional dogfighting, with little opportunity to master energy management or vertical combat concepts. Fuel shortages and limited resources further restricted advanced training. Meanwhile, American flight schools had already integrated combat lessons learned from the Pacific. Replacement pilots arriving in late 1944 were familiar with inverted dive procedures before even flying their first combat sortie. The advantage in knowledge had completely reversed. Japanese aviators, once the most seasoned and adaptable in the Pacific, were now often the least prepared for the evolving tactical realities of the war. The inverted dive tactics pioneered between 1943 and 1945 over the Pacific did not vanish with the end of World War II. They became ingrained in fighter doctrine, though often without direct credit to the desperate ingenuity of P-38 and Corsair pilots who had devised them while fighting for their lives. Modern air combat instruction at institutions such as the Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun, includes negative G maneuvers as standard defensive tactics. The terminology has evolved. Today's aviators refer to it as a negative G pushover or an unloaded roll. Yet the essential physics and purpose remain exactly the same as what Thomas Lynch discovered over New Guinea in April 1943. During the Korean War, American pilots employed similar maneuvers against MiG-15s. The Soviet-designed jet excelled at high altitudes and could outturn most American fighters in level combat. F-86 Sabre pilots, facing challenges remarkably similar to those earlier P-38 pilots had against Zeros, relied on vertical tactics and negative G escapes when MiGs gained a firing advantage. Captain Joseph McConnell, the leading American ace of the Korean conflict with 16 victories, credited both his survival and several kills to what he called rolling out underneath, pursuing MiGs. It was, in essence, the same inverted dive concept, now applied to jet combat at 40,000 feet and 600 miles per hour. Pilots of the Vietnam era had to relearn those lessons through hard experience. Early in that war, American airmen who had been trained primarily for beyond visual range missile combat suddenly found themselves in close-in dogfights with agile MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The early results were disappointing. The creation of Top Gun in 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar represented a formal acknowledgement that dogfighting techniques, including negative G defensive maneuvers, were still vital despite advances in missile technology. Instructors there taught tactics that Pacific War veterans would have recognized immediately. Exploit your aircraft's strengths, avoid the enemy's advantages, and when pressed defensively, go vertical, and if needed, go inverted. Modern fighters are built with negative G capability as a fundamental design element. Aircraft like the F-16, F/A-18, and F-35 have fuel systems, engine configurations, and airframes engineered to withstand sustained negative G flight without the mechanical issues that plagued World War II planes. Pilots now train extensively in centrifuges to develop tolerance to both positive and negative G-forces. The red-out effect that horrified pilots in 1943 has become a known and manageable part of flight physiology, yet the principle behind it remains the same. Negative G maneuvers allow a pilot to perform actions the enemy does not anticipate, gaining separation and creating chances for a counterattack. What makes this World War II innovation remarkable is that it was born completely outside official doctrine. No engineer designed it. No tactics board approved it. No training authority introduced it into curricula until combat pilots had already proven its worth in hundreds of engagements. It spread informally through the pilot community, experienced flyers passing survival techniques to new ones, from one squadron to another, across islands and oceans. The men who created these methods seldom received recognition beyond their own units, and most never realized their improvised solutions would shape aerial combat doctrine for the next 8 decades. Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, survived the war in part because he mastered vertical tactics and wasn't afraid to fly inverted when the situation demanded it. Thomas Lynch, the first to employ the maneuver deliberately,